Good evening, everybody. So happy to see you here. I hope you've had a good day so far. Weather's been gorgeous, and hopefully we'll give you a really good discussion. Afterwards, we have some tea, coffee, and cookies for you outside. And so hopefully your day will end also great, and you'll be able to go home and get ready for tomorrow. So my name is Dr. Deepali Dewan. I'm the Dan Mishra Curator of South Asian Art and Culture here at the Royal Ontario Museum. ROM acknowledges that it sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who have been the original stewards of the land since time immemorial to today. My ancestors come from northern India and northern England. I'm the product of colonial encounters and multiple migrations that have led me to be a settler on this land. As a diasporic person, I'm committed to understanding the history that has allowed me to settle here and my responsibilities to it. And I invite us all to reflect on the ways colonialism and extraction are still with us today. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, where we will explore how complex histories are being captured, archived, and shared in today's multimedia world. This event is made possible by the support of the Dan Mishra South Asia Initiative at the ROM. Since 2017, this initiative has supported programming, special exhibitions, community engagement, and collection care, work related to the art and culture of South Asia and its diaspora at the ROM. As some of you might have noticed, the ROM's permanent South Asia Gallery is currently closed. It is due to a renovation project that is reimagining the ROM and making way for an expanded South Asia Gallery by 2028. Yes, that's a good thing. And while it seems a long ways away, believe me, in museum times, this is like around the corner. My object list is due by like January. So issues of how to represent the past, which past, whose stories, and who gets to tell those stories are front of mind. So I'm so pleased to be joined this evening by two individuals at the forefront of gathering public histories and making an impact on communities in South Asia and its diaspora. We'll speak about their projects, methods, and experiences, and the impact of what could be called their crowdsourced archiving on a generation seeking to find their place in history. Now let me introduce my guests, and as I'm done with their introductions, perhaps they could come on stage. Anchal Malhotra is an oral historian and writer whose work traces the long-term, cross-border, multi-generational impact of the 1947 partition that resulted in the creation of Pakistan and India. She is the author of the critically acclaimed nonfiction books, Remnants of a Separation, A History of Partition Through Material Memory, 2017. It was released to mark India's 70th anniversary of independence, and then it was re-released outside of the subcontinent as Remnants of Partition, 21 Objects from a Continent Divided in 2019. They portray a human history of partition through personal and intimate objects that refugees carried with them across the border during their migration. She has also written In the Language of Remembering, The Inheritance of Partition, 2022, which traces the impact of partition on the next generation. And her latest work is a novel titled The Book of Everlasting Things, listed in NPR's Best Books of 2022. Just to show you some of those intimate objects that people carried on the slide. Anchal's work has won the Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award and has been shortlisted for the British Academy Book Prize and the Sahitya Academy Yuv Purashkar, a literary honor conferred annually by what is essentially India's National Academy of Letters, among other honors. She's the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory. She was born in 1990 in New Delhi, attended OCAD-U and Concordia University in Canada, and currently lives in New Delhi. So, Anshul, please come and join us. Our second guest is Ahsan Zafar. In 2017, Ahsan set up Brown History, an educational archive of South Asian storytelling. It started as a platform for family photos and family stories. Brown History soon gained a keen audience from others, taking inspiration from Zafar's efforts. The page now boasts over 700,000 followers and has solidified into a reputable public photo book, educational platform, and archive of post-colonial storytelling. This is just some examples. Alongside daily posts on Instagram, Zafar now edits a regular newsletter, that publishes submissions from his followers across the globe, runs a shop selling merchandise, and hosts his own podcast of interviews with authors and thinkers, including Anshul, twice, I think, and both podcasts certainly deserve a listen. He was born in 1988. Actually, did I get that right, Ahsan? 87, okay, my math was wrong. 87 in Karachi, grew up in Canada, and trained as an electrical engineer in the aerospace industry in Montreal, currently lives in Toronto. So Ahsan, please come and join us. It is safe to say both of my guests are linking broad categories of belonging, national, community, family, individual, through storytelling and archiving in a way that is touching a nerve today. So with that, we'll start. Okay, great. So I just want to start by saying that you both are archiving South Asia's past, with great success and acclaim. What is your background and experiences that led you to conceive of these projects? And why did you start? And if there's anything you want to add to what I said about your projects, if there's something missing in the intro, please feel free to do that.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for being here, everybody. It's so nice to see a full hall. Deepali mentioned that I studied here in Toronto. I actually studied to be a metal engraver at OCAD, which is really unrelated from both historian and archivist and writer. But for the last decade and a little bit, I have thought very deeply and written 3 books about the 1947 partition of India and its related topics. And the reason for this is, of course, that it exists in my own history. But the impetus to study it for as long as I have was because growing up in Delhi, we were not told any stories of partition. And for someone whose 4 grandparents came from across the border, I think when you learn of partition, you think it's a very strange thing that you haven't heard the word in your house, it hasn't come up, you haven't been told stories of it. So, coupled with the fact that there was silence, there was also the fact that I learned about partition through statistics and numbers at school. And I wondered how people like my grandparents had become statistics. Where were their stories? Why were they not told? And what it means for us to tell our stories. So when I began writing about partition, I was even younger than I am now, and a whole vocabulary had to be learned. A vocabulary that was cross-border, that was empathetic, that was understanding of the historical experience and not diminishing it to a single experience across the subcontinent. So this is why I began writing what I did.
There was no plan. I grew up in Montreal. I went into engineering. I still work in engineering as of now. And in 2017, I just wanted to learn more about my roots. I had read somewhere, some Greek philosopher had said, the first step to happiness is knowing yourself. And I thought, why not start with history? Why not go back? And so I'm Pakistani, and I started to look at Pakistani history, but the more I go way back, the more I could not, there was no boundary, there was no border. We were all kind of, we influenced each other, we were all connected. So to learn my history, I had to learn everybody's history, and that became a South Asia thing. And I didn't want to feel like I was doing nothing with that knowledge, so for fun, I started an Instagram account where whatever I learned, I would post, and I would let my curiosity take me on wherever it goes. Earlier on, the number one complaint I would get is people would DM me saying, why aren't you talking about my people? Why aren't you speaking, they're my people, my language, my religion. And, South Asia is huge. There are so many different communities. I'm one person. There is no way that I could give justice to anybody. So I decided, why don't you just tell your own story? So that's how Brown History Photo Album started. And I did a call out. I said, let's everybody submit your stories. And all of a sudden, like a tidal wave, a tsunami just hit me of people submitting their stories. Clearly there was this huge hunger for it. And as they share their stories, their human personal stories, there's history in that. It comes with history, it comes with culture, it comes with awareness. So I guess in that moment, Brown History stopped being an Instagram account and it became a community.
And I just changed the slide to show one example of the kinds of stories submitted with a photo. And so thinking about it as a kind of public photo book, maybe public family album in many ways.
I submitted a story to it.
She did too, yeah.
I wanted to also just go back to the other slide I have here, if I can, and have Anshul talk about these images while we're talking about family photos and in terms of her connection to Canada.
Well, my connection to Canada goes generations before me. My grandfather came here in 1958 as a graduate student at a time when Canada still had what they call the quota system. So only a certain number of people could come from certain countries. So I think in 1958, 150 people could come from India, and he was one of them. And he came to study soil sciences. That was the big appeal. He came from Delhi to Guelph, and he set roots. There he is as a young man. He used to send these photographs home, and he would write behind them. And that's why we have this archive of his life as a young man. And then, little by little, him and his wife, my grandmother, she's a very cool lady with incredible hairdos and very fashionable, they brought over their entire family. They brought over sisters and brothers. My grandfather's brother's son is sitting right here. My whole family is here. And I think the sense of community that they had here, it mattered a lot to him. And even when he returned to India, the connection with Canada meant a lot to him. And I think for me, now I'm trying to find a way back to his early life here. But it's very difficult to create an entire life belatedly after someone is no longer alive. And so when even this Brown History photo album, it means something to share the story that you want your family to see, for it to be there, and then for other people to relate to it in some way, because someone is going to see the story and say, oh, well, my story isn't that different. I want to share my story too, So, yeah, this is me and Canada and family albums.
And then just making me think about connecting it to, you were just talking about your grandparents being, both sets being affected by partition and having to migrate, and then looking at these photos and thinking about how the legacy of partition is not necessarily just based in South Asia, but in fact amongst us sitting here.
For sure, and these are people, like my grandparents who had multiple migrations. multiple migrations after partition, but then there are also people who migrated at 47, and then at 71, and then across the world to diasporic countries, and they hold memories of all of these migrations within them, overlapping.
So, can you share your most memorable or favorite story that you've collected? And I will advance it a little bit.
I can't
since
see.
we've prepared a little bit.
So on the right is my favorite story, which is cut off.
Oh, it sure is.
You know what? I have it in my email. I'll just read it from my email. Just give me 1 sec. Sorry. Okay, so my parents, on their wedding day on September 28, 1973 in Toronto, Ontario, my mom reluctantly made the big journey to Canada, and my dad followed. My uncle wandered through a local shopping center a few weeks before the wedding and invited anyone who looked brown to attend. Since they had such few family and friends at the time in Toronto, some of my parents' oldest friendships started from their wedding day, which brought together a random selection of homesick South Asians to celebrate the familiar food, music, language, and a sense of community. So, I don't know, whenever I read that story, it makes me feel really good. I don't know why, I mean, maybe I do know why. Most immigrant stories, it's always a good immigrant story if it ends with economic prosperity. And in this case, the end is not about money, it's about just finding where you belong and finding a bunch of people who you can share joy with. And I think I can relate to this because I think we all are trying to find that place where we can all kind of come together and share some beautiful moments together with people. So these kind of stories don't get told in the main narrative of immigrant stories, but this one, it's just different and sticks out. My other second favorite story is on the left, which I have it on my email too. Okay, so it's a little bit longer. Back when my brother got into Harvard for his undergrad, it was a huge deal for my parents. Obviously, it was every Tamil's parents' dream. They had worked their entire life to give us such opportunities. So they used every single resource they had and made sure he was able to go. However, my brother had not secured housing in Cambridge, and the semester was starting in 2 weeks. Everything was full or too expensive, so they drove down to the States and somehow would figure it out. When they got there, my parents were exhausted, couldn't find anything, and felt like they had let my brother down. So after failing to find an affordable place anywhere, my mom went to a payphone. She opened up the first book, remember those? And called up the first Tamil name she stumbled upon. It was a man that was living by himself near university. She told him about the situation and how she needed help. Sure enough, the Tamil man said my brother could stay in his spare room until he found proper housing. Just like that, a global community able to rely on each other. So that's my second favorite story. These are the stories that just add life to the journey and add these nuances that we don't really talk about. And I don't know, I think it's just very important to have it there. And it's just reminds us how important it is to build a community and to support it.
What about you, Anchal?
I wish I had some funny stories. I don't. There's nothing really funny about partition, no matter how much you try. I think one of my favorite stories was I was in Calcutta interviewing a lady who was probably in her late 80s, and she was born in Jalandhar but spent much of her life in Lahore, and after partition, she came back to Jalandhar. But she, as a Hindu woman, got married to a Muslim man, and he had family in Pakistan. And so at some point in her life, as a married woman, she was able to go to Pakistan. Now, when she was in Lahore near Anarkali Bazaar, where she spent her childhood, she went to a shop selling, like a general store. She wanted to buy something. And the man who owned the store, if you're not from a place, it's really easy to tell because of how you speak, even if you speak the same language. So when I go to Pakistan, if I speak Urdu, they'll know I'm not from Pakistan, even though I'm speaking Urdu. So similarly, she's speaking Punjabi, but her Punjabi is a little bit different. So the shopkeeper says, "Ke tusi kahan se ho? Where are you from?" And she says, "Oh, I'm from Jalandhar." And he says, "You're from India?" She said, "Yeah, I'm from Jalandhar. I've come here for a wedding. And actually, it's this lady right here." And he looks at her and he says, "Before partition, I was also from Jalandhar. और तुसी मुट्ठी भर मिट्टी ना ले आते हमारे लिए? Couldn't you carry a fistful of soil for the people here?" And I think when I heard that story, it's such a basic thing, but it means so much to people. So ever since I heard that story, I've become sort of a soil person, which is weird if I think about it, because my grandfather studied soil sciences. Now, this is what I'm thinking about more and more these days. But anytime I am in a place, either in India or Pakistan, where one of my interviewees has come from before partition, I always collect a bit of soil. And I've made sure to give it to my cousins, to my aunts, to my uncles, because they may think of this larger sense of belonging that surpasses this militarized border at some point in their life. And it matters to have that little muthi bhar mitti, little piece of soil with them. So, yeah, it's probably one of my favorite sentiments.
Lovely. So I guess kind of getting into the nitty-gritty, like, how do you find stories? How do they come to you? And then when you do find them or have them shared with you, what do you do with them? Like, I'm sure it's not just someone submits something and then you post it. I'm sure there's a process involved. And so what's that about?
It's simple, but it's a bit complicated. I'll just ask for it, and people will submit stories, and clearly there's a hunger for it. There's a hunger to be, right there. I would just post a story and be like, anybody out there wants to submit a story. I'll get like 100. Let's say I get 100 stories. 90% will get rejected, because I guess at the end of the day, it is a story, and storytelling is a skill, and you have to be able to get the audience's attention and not just give them facts and figures. The amount of stories I get about someone becoming a doctor and making their parents proud, it's like self-promotion nonstop. I don't know what it is, but the whole point of Brown History is to let someone else have the spotlight. Like that's like number one rule. Like someone else in the podcast, if you notice, it's the guest talking. I barely say anything on the stories. It's about people who submit stories talking about a mom or dad, somebody else, not about themselves. So that to me is very important, is that someone else always gets the light. So people submit stories and I'll read them, and they're not that long, and they're very quick and honest. And I guess I'm looking for is honesty, and I usually do not touch the story. But sometimes I'll ask questions like, how did your mom feel? How did your dad feel? And then once that door opens and they feel comfortable, then it's paragraph after paragraph. The goal is to humanize these people and these historical events that's happened. And once that happens, once like it's good, I'll publish it. And the story continues from there. Like once you publish it, it's not over. One of the really interesting things about now is that there's the comment section. So now a story belongs to the people, and then the people who can relate or who are part of that culture or who have family witness that event, whatever the subject of the story is, they'll add in theirs and they'll make their comments. And then next thing you know, it's like a democracy. It's like history has been, be turned into a democracy. And it has a life on its own, and that's it. and someone will see that story and be like, and feel motivated to be like, you know what, my parents were in partition also. I want to be part of this. I want my parents to be part of this, my grandparents to be part of this. And then they'll submit a partition story, and next thing you know, I'll have a sequence of partition stories, which has to eventually fizzle out, and then we go on to another topic, and someone will submit a story about immigration in New York, and next thing you know, after that, it'll be, stories of immigration. So there is like a community glue that comes and goes, and there is this kind of comment section where people give their own life to it. So that to me is probably the best part. With a podcast episode, I'll do a podcast and then I'll put it out there. I have no idea if anybody has listened to it. I don't know if people have actually finished it. There's no comment section, there's nothing. But with a post on a story, it's like putting seeds in the ground and flowers are growing.
I love what you're saying, how that the story is not just the post, but in fact the comments become part of the text of the story.
Yeah. But to be fair, there are a lot of negative comments too.
I mean,
that's
holistically the comments.
Yes, but sometimes we can talk about this after. But sometimes people get mad.
We'll ask a question about that shortly.
Right.
But
yeah.
First, Anshul, I want you to sort of talk about also, and
well, when I started
even what's going on in this image.
I'm speaking to Uma Ahmed about her soil, and the other one is from when I had started working on partition, and it was actually my thesis project when I was at Concordia. So when I started working on partition, my idea was to archive objects that refugees had carried across borders in 1947 to India and to Pakistan. And I was, I think, 22 at the time. How does a 22-year-old know partition refugees? I lived in the city of Delhi, which, is basically a refugee city because the demography of the city changed overnight at partition. It became a largely Hindu Punjabi city when it wasn't before. But still, I think I didn't know how to ask questions. I think this is a really important thing. How do you ask the questions about things that are sensitive, about things that are traumatic? What is the threshold of your questioning? When do you have to stop? What are the words that you use? What is the language that you use? All of this had to be learned on the job for me because I was trained as a metal engraver, right? Not an oral historian. But I think what is essential for me is that there was a necessity to do this work. I was interested, I was invested, and I knew that I needed to, like SN, find out what my history was. So I started asking my grandparents if they knew people apart from them who had migrated at partition, and I got some contacts, but the point was that I was looking for objects, and not everyone had objects. So what my mother would do, my parents run a small bookshop in Delhi, which is a very public-facing job. So when someone would come in that looked old, my mother, who is exceedingly charming and just such a great people person, was like, did you come at partition by any chance? Did you bring anything? Can my daughter come and look at it? So, it's pretty funny for people because you're not asking, well, tell me your memory of that time. You're saying, but what did you bring? What are the things? Why did you bring this? Why this and not this? But there was a reason for that. It's very difficult to ask the questions, as I said. And I also didn't know how to ask. And sometimes the topic is so sensitive, but you're so young and brazen that you don't really understand that. So you just ask, and it offends people. And then it's awkward. However, when you ask about the object, like if I say, oh, okay, you carried this ring with you, that's interesting. Why did you carry this ring to Pakistan? Your mother told you it was valuable so you could sell it in the camp. Why didn't you sell it? And how did you hear of this partition? Or you heard it on the radio? What language did the radio program come in? Do you remember the date? Do you remember the weather? Do you remember the season? Do you remember the month? Okay, you heard it in Urdu. Did you also go to an Urdu-speaking school? What were your friends like? What was your house like? And so what you're doing via the object is not just understanding partition and its connection, but you are understanding a social ethnography of a life that existed before partition and how that life was fractured because of this political event that really had nothing to do with the common person. So I relied very heavily on my mother. I relied very heavily on my aunt, who would do the same thing when she went for walks in the park. You're laughing, but it was super effective. And I think they just asked. And I am such an introvert that I feel like I just can't go up to someone and just ask. But I needed that because it taught me that the project was so much more than just me. It was such a community project. And then I think eventually, as the project grew and a few years passed, Instagram played a really big role for me as well, because I would post little snippets of my interviews. And I don't know, this is in 2013, 2014. I don't know if people had posted things like that before, but somehow the stories from people's mouths resonated with younger people. Not necessarily with older people, but with younger people. People so far removed from the tragedy of partition, people younger even than me. And so to see this third, sometimes fourth generation take up the mantle and say, I would like to ask my family what their story is. And will you come to record my grandfather? Will you come to record my grandmother? We are based in Chennai. We are based in Calcutta. Are you going to be here at any point? I think, like I was saying before, it matters to people that their story matters to you. And one thing you have to keep in mind while being an oral historian, and something I learned pretty early, talking to these various people, is that listening, active listening, is a real skill, right? There is a difference between listening and hearing. The fact that the generation who lived through partition, an elderly generation, feels palpable loneliness as well, and a young person comes and listens to their stories and makes meaning of them and helps them take ownership of that story and helps them feel seen, it matters. It matters who tells the story. It matters the words you use to tell the story. And it matters that it is told in a manner of dignity. This is why oral history is so essential, particularly to cultures like ours in South Asia that are cultures of oral storytelling. It's not that we don't have records. It's just that we are not writers of records. We always pass down stories, just verbally.
Can I ask you just to talk a little bit more about, once someone shares a story with you, are you taking notes? Are you recording it? And then when you have it, how do you translate it into a chapter?
That's a good question. I don't do any video interviews because I feel like elderly people, they get very conscious and their manner of storytelling changes if there's like a video camera in front of them. But I know many people that do that. I only take audio interviews, and that too for many, many years, nearly a decade, on my phone. Because, you tell them you're recording and you keep it there and they kind of forget it, that it's recording, because it's a phone, it's such an ordinary thing. So I take audio interviews and then I do take notes. Sometimes I take notes of things that they have said, lines that I want to remember. Other times I take notes of their body language, because you see, oral history is not about only what is said, but also about what remains unsaid. So where is the person changing their language? Are they speaking in Urdu and then Punjabi? Why is that change happening? Where are they crying? Where are they laughing? Where are they pausing? When do they say, okay, this is enough? When do they say things like, but you know what I mean? You know what I mean. You've seen it, right? So the interview can go on from anywhere between an hour to 4 or 5 hours. I've sat with people and had breakfast and then chai and then lunch and then missed my train and all of that stuff. But you will stay until the story is not finished, according to them. Whenever they think it's done, then you leave. Because many times during the interview also people are like, well, aren't you tired of listening to this? Hasn't it been so long? And after the recording, I transcribe it, I translate it into English, because I think in English and I write in English. And then I write the story, and then I share the story with the person, just as an ethical practice, so that they can see what is being written about them based on what they've said and my observations. And then we can change, we can edit, we can move things around if they want. But ultimately, they have to be happy with the way the story is told.
And to be fair, I think part of your documentation is not just the oral, but the photography of the objects. And I have to comment that these aren't snaps of someone's object. This is sometimes what I think of as a beautifully composed photograph.
Well, the photograph is often taken at the end of the interview. So you have spent a significant amount of time with someone, and there is an intimacy which I think can be felt in the manner in which they offer the object to you as well. You know? Yeah.
And Asan, you've talked about how photographs seem to have a quality that captures people in some ways and are a sort of an integral part of the stories that you collect.
Photos have this magical quality to it, which I don't know how to describe it, but it's almost as if it's like, to the reader, it's like proof that this happened. Like, okay, now I believe you. Oh, you have a photo? I believe you. And sometimes stories can tell stories on their own, but sometimes I think for people who read history and read books, imagination comes into play. And it's easy to me to imagine, you know, a story of a Victorian Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen, all that stuff I can imagine if I were to read it. But I think for a lot of people, when you're reading a story, a true story of any kind, a war story or a love story about a certain time in the South Asia region during a certain year, I think it's hard for them to kind of picture something. And these photos that people are submitting, they show what it's like then. One photo I remember going so viral, and the story wasn't like anything special. I mean, it was special, no offense.
Well,
but like nothing happened.
Special.
They're all special. But like no event occurred. It was just a story about how, you know, husband and wife fell in love and had a kid. But the photo was like from the 60s, 70s, and it showed the mom and dad being intimate, like just like looking into each other's eyes. Are they gonna kiss? Are they not? They're holding hands. They're on top. They're like neck cuddling with each other. And that went viral just because you don't see that from the 60s, 70s from our culture, from that culture. So, and I'm sure people who never imagined that was a possibility, it probably struck them with awe, and then they shared it, and then it became viral because you don't see that often. Especially the fact that it's true, like that's an actual love story, it's an actual couple, and the daughter is submitting it, so we know 50 years later it was a happy story, and the daughter is proud of her parents, and she would love to show it off. So it's like a full circle, and this photo is like the icing on the cake. And it's like a magical thing, and I don't know how to describe it. Not that like without the photo, you know, like the stories are important too, but photos are just like that gift, I guess, or like that, I don't know, a toy in a Happy Meal or something. I don't know.
First of all, I need you to talk into the microphone.
Sorry.
Not move this hand.
Sorry.
So, Anchal, have you ever received a story that has made you uncomfortable and that you chose not to include, or that you chose to include anyway?
Multiple times. Something that comes to mind when I was writing my second book is when we think of partition, we often think of people being victims of violence. But very rarely do we ever hear the story of perpetrators. I received an email, an anonymous email at one point saying, would you like to hear the story of an uncle of mine who sold women during partition? I heard, how do you respond to that, really? I think what this story taught me is how to take care of stories that you may not agree with. So I wrote back saying, yes, I would like to listen to it. And I, until then I had never heard a story of a perpetrator. There are really so few. And it's also weird because the perpetrator is a kind of nameless, faceless other until you come into, contact with a real story. So this person sent me emails every now and then. They weren't very regular. I replied. I would always think about what to say because you have to think about what to say in these circumstances. Anyway, their uncle was a man who sold and dealt in women at the time of partition. These were women who were often left behind in villages after their families had been killed. And many of them tried to escape, and some of them did not. And then they told the story, and I wrote it because I was planning to include it in my second book. And I think the manner in which I wrote the story was incredibly wrathful and angry. And I am not an angry person. I did not know that I had that side in me. But all of the stories they were recounting were of women who were essentially my age, and vulnerable women, emotionally, physically. And so all of that wrath that I felt and all of that sadness and empathy I felt for them came out in the language I used in the story. And it was awful. It was awful, and it was angry, and it was biased. But I didn't realize that at the time, right? I was writing the story from my perspective. I sent it to them, and when they read it, they were very upset because, well, they wrote back saying, well, who are you to judge this person? Who are you to judge my uncle? He got what was coming to him. But your job as a historian is to record the versions of history, the versions that are told to you, whether you agree with them or not. Your job is to archive it. Your job is not to judge it, right? It is to interpret it, but not to judge it. So I rewrote the narrative and I sent it back, and they were okay with that. But I felt it was important in the writing of the story in the book to write this incident in, to show that the scholar, the researcher, the historian, even someone who deals with this on an everyday basis, is not devoid of bias or anger or othering. And we are also human. So we go through these things. The point is that whether or not we unlearn and then relearn from them. So I felt like it was a story that taught me the ethics of storytelling, right? On a totally different way than what I was already doing.
Asan, as we know, people are emboldened to say whatever they want to on social media. Has there been a story that has incited a strong backlash? And has that response made you change how you pick or present stories going forward?
Every story has people hating on it. If I post the Indian story, there's a Pakistani saying this sucks, and if I post a Pakistani story, an Indian is saying it sucks. It's a Muslim, Hindu, English, Bengali, everybody has a hate club. So you ignore it. However, it is the only way that I've learned in this journey how to do this, because I have no training in history. The last class I took in history was in grade 9 or something. I have no idea that I'm even here. I have no idea how I got here. And I only learned this through trial and error, and it gets so complicated, and it's very, very difficult, and there are many times where I wanted to just quit because it's hard to figure out the ethics of this. One time, a girl from some state in New York, some city in the state of New York, submitted a story about her great-grandmother, her grandmother from North India, some small village. I've never heard of it before. And in the picture, it's these two 10-year-old girls, sisters, wearing traditional outfits and wearing a hat. It's a black and white photo, but I don't know what the color is. But according to her, it's green. And she was just talking about how it was like a very, simple story about a grandmother's going to school and they had to walk a very far distance. And casually she mentions somewhere that there is honor tied to these hats and they're very important and many people take them to the grave with them. And their different colors represent different things. And I'm like, okay, I had no idea, I didn't know anything. I posted it. It turns out that the hats are tied to class and caste. And the color of your hat represents what caste and what class you're from. And I had no idea. And so a lot of negative comments, and, but it taught me that like I have to be aware of these blind spots. It's so difficult because these blind spots change depending on the person, and I know, I guess I'm naive, and still am, but it's very important to be aware of these power dynamics that are kind of plagued all over the region, and they come in different forms, and the symptoms come in different ways, sometimes in clothing, and sometimes in name, and sometimes in the story itself. And it's my job, and sometimes I fail, to be aware of these power dynamics and not erase anyone's identity or story. We don't have any mechanism in place to tell these stories in the way that, like, for example, here in Canada, there was a slide that said that we're on ancestral lands, that we're on stolen lands. And there are signs outside, and you go to a lecture, they mention that at the beginning. These are mechanisms in place to let you know your privilege and to let you know how far, like what's happened, and to put things in context. I wish there was some kind of mechanisms like this in South Asian histories where I could kind of have this in place so that I don't mess up and I don't miss any blind spots. But it took Canada years. 2 days ago we had Truth and Reconcile Day, and that came in 2001, I think. So imagine in Canada's history how long it took to get that day. So we're just, I guess, fresh, and we're just beginning, and we're new to this, and there's going to be a lot more trial and errors, but hopefully, slowly, as a collective, we can kind of have mechanisms in place so that we don't forget we don't erase someone's dignity out of this. And for me, that's the really hard part. But thank God for the comment section. They will not forget and they will not forgive. Yeah.
So this brings up the topic of like fact checking, and people's memories can be faulty. They can be passing on information perhaps that's not actually accurate, and storytelling is exactly that. It's telling a story from a point of view, and so in some ways you're never going to get away from that personal kind of perspective. So what role does that play in your work? This idea of fact-checking, citations, references.
Me or her?
Both, but one at a time, maybe Anshul first.
Would you like to?
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of secondary research based on my interview. So usually someone, if they say something even very obscure like, near my house there was a river. It's a very innocent thing. But you can usually tell what the river is. If they say, in 1929, I saw Pandit Nehru standing right next to a white horse, walking through the city of Lahore, going through the river Ravi and declaring Purn Swaraj, that also happened. And there is a record for that. But what happens when you actually don't know whether someone is telling the truth? When, let's say, the story is so horrific and the details are so gruesome of attacks, of rape, of arson, whatever. one way to do it is to collect several stories from the same region to see if the details add up. I did some work with Hindu and Sikh Mirpuris, who came from the region of Mirpur, now in Pakistan. And when I recorded my first story from that area, it was horrifying. It was horrifying to the extent that I couldn't believe, just couldn't believe a single family had gone through it. And then I recorded another story, and another story, and another story, and they were all absolutely the same. And there are not a lot of records of this area, at least in Indian archives. So the only records I found were in the International Red Cross, and they corroborated the stories. And so that is one way. But I think also, you see, at the beginning of my career, I was very interested in answering this question about veracity. But the question that was asked to me most often was, well, oral history is not real history, it's just memory. You're just collecting memories. You're not collecting real history, they're not facts. And I would try and defend just memory. But now, actually, I don't really care so much about defending just memory, because the written history is also written from a particular perspective. When you go into an archive and you access an archive of a particular time period, it's usually written by the person who won a war or was the king of an empire and their scribes. So it is also one version of history. So if your grandmother or your uncle or your aunt or your neighbor is telling you their version of it, it is just as viable. Oral history needs to work in conjunction with written history to be as wholesome, holistic, believable, and meaningful as possible. They have to work together. So now I'm not so interested in defending my methodology. But of course, there are ways to corroborate these things.
It's hard to fact check the Instagram DMs. There are like kind of like loopholes, like there's ways to cheat, okay? Like if someone, if my dad tells me a story, I'm not gonna fact check his story. But if I were to forward that story to somebody else, I would say something like, my dad said, and then yada, 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 yada. And therefore, when I say that, I've established an understanding that this is an oral story passed down, and this is what my dad said. I'm new at this. So once I say something like my dad said, or his dad said, right there I've established kind of an understanding that like we're going by memory here. We're going by what this person said. And what this person, my father, said, it doesn't really matter the dates. It doesn't really matter, region maybe. What matters is the heart of that story. So if my dad says my dad told me he came to Canada in 1971, and yada yada, he had a hard time, yada yada yada. But like 1971 could easily be changed to 1970s, or it could be changed to 1970s, 80s if he doesn't remember. So it doesn't. Those details can be kind of changed a bit so that we can leave like a range for the correct year. So it's really hard to fact check. I mean, there are obviously things to question and make sure, like, are you sure? And like, your story doesn't make sense because in history this happened. And they're like, okay, I'm sorry, you're right. I just spoke to my grandmother and she now kind of thinks it's like this. So then we can change it to like, my grandmother thinks that it was this city she lived in, and this is where she met her husband, and yada yada yada. So for me, it's not really about facts. It's memory and it's memories, and it's an Instagram page, and the audience, they're quick. They need the quick fix, and they need to go to the next thing, and I can't put facts and numbers and things like that. I need to get them right away, and we need to get to the heart and soul of it, and we need to teach them something in the process and trick them in a way, so it doesn't go to waste, and then they move on to the next thing. So things it's changed on Instagram. It's quick little bits and pieces, but like hopefully it takes them to the books and it takes them to the library and it takes them to their own research and then kind of put pieces together and make a big picture.
Kind of collective fact-checking in
Yeah.
some ways. I'm just looking at the time, and I want to kind of merge a few questions together so that we can get some of the other stuff covered. And then we will have time to open up for comments and questions from the audience, maybe a few minutes. But I guess I want to acknowledge that in some ways there are other projects that have a lot of synergy with what you both are doing. I'm thinking about, there's the 1947 Partition Archive, there's the South Asian American Digital Archive, there's the South Asian Canadian Digital Archive, actually, at University of Fraser Valley. There's the Mumbai-based Anusha Yadev's Indian Memory Project. And there, are people here. Purana Pakistan is based in Toronto, and there are people here in the audience who also artists, filmmakers who do similar things. And so, I guess I'm wondering if you can comment on just, do you feel like what you're doing is part of a larger movement, and can you comment on sort of the reaction that you've gotten, and have you been surprised by the reaction that you've gotten to your projects? And where is that reaction mostly coming from? Like, what kind of demographic?
Well, I feel like definitely you can't work in isolation if you're working with other people. So every day, I think I learn something from another writer, another project. I guess you're not an island. When you want to work with people's stories, you can't work in isolation with people's stories. The writing process may be an isolated process, but the process of gathering information, talking about what you have recorded, for me, it's a really important thing to have a network of other oral historians. Like, for instance, when I recorded that first story from Mirpur that was so incredibly traumatic, I stopped recording stories for 4 months after that, and the only thing I did was speak to other oral historians who recorded stories of partition to know how they dealt with secondhand trauma. What does it do to them? So I think that the community of storytellers is really important, and this doesn't mean that you have to sit and chat over coffee all the time about what you record, but it means that you acknowledge that your work informs my work, informs another project. In the future, we may be able to collaborate on something. I would like to check some details about a story that I'm recording that someone I know has also recorded. I think that kind of synergy is necessary because we need to work in a community. And by that, I also mean across borders. One of my favorite people to read, to learn from, and really who helps me to understand the information I record is the Pakistani oral historian Anam Zakaria. She's written about partition, she's written about Bangladesh and the 71 war or liberation, and she's written about Kashmir. And I think listening to her helps me learn something new about my own area of expertise. We are able to have those conversations, and I'm grateful for that, because you need someone who understands. You need someone who's been on the other side of recording stories, who understands the heaviness of recording intimate stories, that you can discuss this with, because not everyone will understand. And in terms of where you see resonance in the demography of people, it's young people. I think there are two kinds of things I've seen. Usually when a partition survivor or witness tells their story, they always will say, oh, but we don't have anything to tell. We are not Nehru, we are not Gandhi, we are not Jinnah, we are not Mountbatten. What are you here discussing with us? And then they go on to tell the most incredible story of resilience and courage and friendship and understanding and survival. And then when you write that story and you take it back to them, when I've interviewed people, I always take a copy of, at least the elder people, a copy of the book and give it to them to say, this is your story, now it's published, it is the version that we discussed, this is for you. And they will always read the page and say, yes, this is how it was. And you say, yeah, remember I was here, we did the interview, these are your words, and they say, yes, this is how it was. So it matters to them that the story is there, number one. That also means that there is an ownership of a story that may or may not have been voiced before. The onus of silence cannot always be on the silent generation. It has to be shared with descendant generations. Sometimes it is very difficult to start a conversation when there is no context. You need someone to ask the questions, even if they are questions they don't know how to ask, right? Or you need a photograph, or you need an object, you need a catalyst. So I've seen an ownership of stories in that survivor generation. But in the descendants, it is the third generation who is most active in preservation of stories, in the writing of stories, in the listening to stories. And so the question that we should be considering is, why does memory skip a generation? Why do we need distance from an event of trauma to introspect on that trauma?
What was the question? Sorry, I think I remember. There is a lot of talented people. There is so much talent in the community. It's insane, and it's so nice to see people doing these crazy, amazing things. And it's very important to have a support group to go to someone and be like, someone said something mean to me today. Oh, and then they can like, it's okay. And they're always. Do I feel like, am I a part of a movement? Yes and no. I feel like everyone is kind of scattered around everywhere, and everyone is trying to find their spot. I just wish there was institutions and bigger places out there where they can kind of bring everyone together to like work on things and do things and create things. So right now it's something. But I just feel everybody is, all over the place. And at the same time, I think half of the people that you mentioned, like, I think they have a full-time job that they're working really hard, and then eventually they're gonna have families and they're gonna be busy, and they have no monetary support to do the thing that they love to do, the thing that people are relying on and using as inspiration. So eventually that's gonna fade out. So it's very hard for all of us to come together to form a movement, a wave, if we're all focused on our full-time jobs and trying to balance everything together. And it's hard to be creative when you're worried about paying the bills. So I think if one day we get to a point where there are grants out there and scholarship programs and a more bigger audience, then anything's possible.
And who's your demographic?
My demographic?
Online, you can have all the stats at your fingertips,
yes.
right?
I mean, I can give you the stats if you want. Like 60% are women, 40% are men, obviously. And number one country is India. Number two is America. Number three is the United Kingdom. And it's all young people, like 18 to 25 is the number one population. And that's a hungry bunch, and they're young, and they want to know more. They're hungry, and they want to be heard. So they're trying to figure it out. They're restless.
And I guess I want to ask, as my last question, is how do you sustain this? How do you pay the bills? And what is the next step for you?
Oh, I'm a full-time writer.
She's doing good.
So
she's doing well.
No, that's not what that means. No.
Yes, but how do you pay the bills?
That means when you write, you get paid. Actually, it's you have to be smart about your finances, because I think about this all the time. As a full-time writer, and it's such a privilege to be able to call yourself that as well, because I think it's only been a few years that I can say that I used to work before, and then take small sabbaticals, and then work on books. And it's very difficult. Your brain is always fragmented in that way. So I finally decided to work on writing full time. Please buy my books. That's it. It goes directly here, and it helps. Otherwise, yes, for writers, there are grants. But hundreds of people are fighting for the same grants. So what is the likelihood of your project getting selected? And what is the likelihood of your publisher wanting to continue to work with you? And, how many editions, and where are you going to be published, and how are you going to market it? These things are real things that we have to see on an everyday basis. This is what pays the bills.
I mean, I'm working 9 to 5. I chose Wednesday because I'm working from home on Wednesdays. So this way I could leave early and come here. So there is some money. I do sell some merch. There's a newsletter. People donate money. So there is some, we can go to a restaurant sometimes and things are good. But I do this. I enjoy what I do, and thank God I have a really good work ethic that I can kind of balance it all. But for others, it's very difficult, and I don't know if they give grants to Instagram pages. I haven't found one. But people are really lovely. They do. We'll talk after. People are really lovely, and they donate and they support, and they really love the posters and the newsletter. Yeah, it's tough. Maybe I should write books.
Also tough.
Yeah, it's tough. Just if you love what you do, it's not work. Then that's all I can say.
Okay, well, we have gone over our time, and I think we can take just a few questions or comments, something that would be fast, and I think the rest would have to happen out in the audience. So very quickly, okay, this as the hand I saw first, please go ahead. And there are microphones, so just stand up and we'll get past a microphone or raise your hand. Try it now. We need the microphone turned on. Okay, you be loud and then I'll repeat your question.
Okay, better?
No.
No.
Okay, I'll try to be loud.
Yeah.
So I normally don't get picked, so I'm excited. I'm pretending this is on. This is a question for both of you. What you guys have built individually, and it's very personable, right? It's personal, and that's probably how it started. And oftentimes when you're doing that, you have to be very vulnerable, put yourself out there, your stories out there. That's really hard to do, especially for people who grow up as South Asians. It's really hard for me to do. How did you deal with that? Because you can't truly build and be without being authentically yourself. And how did you deal with that vulnerability piece? That's something I struggle with daily, and I think that's something you both would have had to probably come through as well.
Oh, I'll just repeat it very quickly. It's a question about, to be able to put yourself out there, you have to be authentic, but there's a vulnerability to it. And particularly coming from a South Asian background, sometimes vulnerability is not the thing we're taught to put out in public. So how did you deal with that? I hope I represented that correctly. How did you deal with that?
I think there was never a question for me of not being honest about what it was that I was searching for, and that was my own personal history. We are products of all the people who come before us, and I am notorious in my family to ask very uncomfortable questions. No one likes that. But eventually you become a repository of this web of intimate stories that show you how human your family, your community, the people who live in the same city as you are. And I don't know, it can catch you off guard, the how much you choose to reveal. I constantly worry about how much real stuff about me, and I don't mean real stuff as in what my real name is and how old I am. That stuff is not real. What is in your heart, how much of that is out there, because that is what's on the page, and how much of people I love is out there, right? But I don't really think that for me to write anything true, I can avoid that.
I think it's important to note that me putting myself out there and her putting herself out there, the experience of a woman on the internet is very different than the experience of a man. So kudos to her is 10 times worse for her. Secondly, I don't know how to answer that question. I don't really put myself out there. I'm a coward. I don't, you know what, to be honest, I don't even think there's space for me there. Like, it's other people's stories and it's history, and I have no business being in there. So for me, like, if I were to put myself out there, that would be inauthentic. That would be not fair and cringy and narcissistic. So there is no space for me. And even in the podcast, I tell the guests, like, you're doing most of the talking. Don't look at me. I'm just gonna ask questions. I just repeat what he says because there's just no space for me, and I'm okay with that, and I'm happy with that, and it should be like that. So, I don't know if that helps your question or not.
And I think it's worth acknowledging this is actually Esen's first public
This is my first
appearance. So thank you for that. And it was his idea, so it's his
First and
fault.
last. First and
It's
last.
first and last. Something else, I saw a hand like over here. Okay, yep, right in the middle.
Hello. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
This
it's
is
working.
loud. Yeah. Hi. So wonderful listening to both of you. You guys both sound amazing and look amazing. So thank you for that. My question is that both of you aren't historians in the conventional sense, and one of you is an engineer, very brown, and you are a medal something or the other.
Try again.
Yeah, I just got the medal part. I couldn't understand the rest of it. So how does that? What's the one thing that you learned from your conventional background, your education or your day job in your case, Esen? What's the one thing that translates into being a historian?
In engineering, they say that you only use 10% of what you learn, and when it comes to engineering, I think they don't really. What they teach in engineering is for you to learn quick, to learn fast, to pick up on things quick. So I think I took that with me into this history passion project, and my ability to quickly learn things and grasp things quickly is probably my weapon, my asset. I don't know what the word is. And superpower, yeah, that's good. And yeah, and at the same time, I think being an outsider helps a lot. Like, coming into this thing called history and being like, okay, what is this? Why? What's the story? What's important? What's not important? And looking at it from an alien, from an outsider perspective, really helps a lot. And it's almost like I'm a beginner trying to figure it out, and the audience is a beginner learning it through me as I learn through the experts and the books. I dumb it down.
I studied metal engraving, which is an art form. I attended nearly a decade of art school, did my BFA and MFA, and I think the most important thing I learned, which I carry now because I don't have a studio practice anymore, is how to see things. In art school, they teach you how to observe things, really see things, so that you can depict them visually, or in my case, typographically. But it's very important for me to be able to bring my reader into my scene. So the intimacy with my surrounding is I think, what I carried with me from my conventional education.
Thank you so much.
One last one. Yeah, over here in this side, on the edge. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. Oh, it works now. Great. Very quickly, I guess this applies more to Achal than Esen, just based on the nature of the work. But I was wondering if language barriers ever come up and how you go about approaching them.
That's such a great question. When I started off this work, I was on a sabbatical from Canada, from my grad program, and I was in India. And the initial few interviews I did were all in English because that was the language that I would speak every day here. And I learned very quickly that that's not going to work, because the story of the past must be told in the language of the past. And while I speak many of those languages, whether it is Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu, understanding parts of Bangla, parts of Gujarati, you can't speak everything. So I find it really helpful, if it's a language I don't know, to have a member of the family sitting with me. So not only are they adding to the story, but they are also conversing with the interviewee and also translating what they're saying. And there is a kind of interesting generational interaction that happens there that's really beautiful to witness and adds another layer to the story. That's how I go about it. And then after I record the story, for transcription, I would probably work with someone who speaks and writes that language to listen and transcribe that interview for me.
Okay, so I want to thank you both so much for being here with us tonight, your generosity of sharing. Thank you all for joining us and coming out. As I mentioned, there is a little reception outside. We can talk further. And while the South Asia Gallery is closed, we're going to be doing a lot more South Asian arts and culture programming, both in person and online. So you can go to the ROM website. I think there's a program newsletter you can sign up for free, and get notified of those different events that are happening. So thank you so much, and thank you to both of you.